Good afternoon. Our next speaker, Dr. Ron Westrom, is an emeritus professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan, where he has taught for over 40 years. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Social Relations from Harvard University. He received honors in 1966 and a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Chicago in 1972. He is a specialist on the sociology of science and technology and on complex organizations. He has spoken to numerous international conferences on organizational study in aviation, nuclear power, and medicine, and published about 40 articles and written 3 books, the most recent of which is Sidewinder, Creative Missile Design at China Lake, which was published in 1999. For many years, he was the editor of the newsletter Social Psychology of Science. He has been studying UFOs since college and has conducted field investigations of anomalies as well as written multiple articles on the topic. He was formerly a sociology consultant to MUFON and is working on a book entitled Hidden Events, Information Flow About Anomalies. Here to talk about science and hidden events, let me welcome to the stage Dr. Ron Westrom.
I told you it was tricky. How are you? All right, can everybody hear me? Very good. So what we're going to do is talk about hidden events today. Hidden events is a category of things that run below the surface of the social radar. And a good definition of hidden event is one given by Raymond Moody in his book on near-death experiences. And he said that near-death experiences are very widely experienced, but very well hidden. And in fact, when we look at hidden events, what we see is that the visible cases for hidden events are often a very small percentage, sometimes different by orders of magnitude from the real extent of whatever the hidden event is. Now, an interesting observation is that science does not do well when it deals with the counterintuitive and the impossible. Hidden events are both counterintuitive and impossible. Now, it's interesting to look at the word impossible itself, and I found this definition in a novel called Tom Jones, written by Henry Fielding. And it says, impossible, a word which in common conversation is used not only to signify improbable, but often what is very likely and sometimes what has certainly happened. Okay, so why doesn't science cope very well with hidden events? Well, a couple observations. First of all, science deals far better with the routine than it does with the extraordinary. Another thought is that perhaps our image of science reflects science's ideals rather than its realities. What are the ideals of science? Okay, well, supposedly science is like this. It's honest, it's objective, it's dispassionate. Theory and data agree. But there's a catch. And the catch is that what I've just described about science is typical of science in the long run. Okay? Science is dispassionate. It is objective. It is open-minded and honest, but only in the long run. In the short run, science may be quite different. For instance, one of the people that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, Ernst Friedrich Florenz Chladni, said this about his own approach. He said, people ask me by what stroke of luck I made my discoveries, but chance never favored me. To succeed, he said, I have had to employ an opinionated persistence. Now think about the science courses that you took in junior high and high school and so forth. How often did anybody mention opinionated persistence? Okay? But this is the reality of science as opposed to the image. When scientists interact with other scientists and disagree, often they behave very badly. Now you can think about this in relationship to UFOs. First of all, they make sweeping generalizations. Second of all, they say things that are not true. Third, they make assumptions that don't hold up. And fourth, they play rough with other scientists. Okay? This is the reality of science as opposed to the textbook idealized version of science that many of us absorbed. Why is the behavior of scientists important? It's important because science is today the final arbiter, it seems. Ted Peters may have a different view on this, of what is real and what is not. This function of arbiter of what is real was formerly filled by priests, the people I'm sure that Ted knows far more about than I do. But as the authority of priests has waned, that of science has risen. And yet, we need to realize that science is not always willing to tell us what it knows. Now, an interesting example of this, quite relevant and obviously of worldwide importance, was the covering up of the information about the ozone hole. How many of you have heard about the ozone hole? Show of hands. Okay. So the British were the ones to spot the lack of ozone that today constitutes what we call an ozone hole. And when they did, basically, they couldn't believe their own readings. In 1982, when they first discovered it, they thought their data was wrong. And I'll explain why in just a moment. And so they kept checking. They actually renewed their equipment to see if they hadn't made a mistake. But the new equipment gave the same story. Meanwhile, they didn't tell anybody. Hole in the ozone layer was an earth-shaking matter, however, okay, because obviously all of us depend on the ozone layer to protect us from ultraviolet rays. Well, why didn't they speak up? The main reason they didn't speak up, by the way, is that if the hole existed, the Americans would have seen it because they had this. This is the Nimbus 7 satellite. This is a weather monitoring satellite that NASA created essentially for looking at things like pollution and so forth. But it has a special sensor on it called the TOMS sensor. And the TOMS sensor is a total ozone management sensor. And that sensor should have told the Americans that there was an ozone hole, but it didn't. Why did that happen? Well, turns out that the Nimbus 7 special sensor for ozone had a computer. And we'll see what the computer did in just a moment. But meanwhile, in 1985, the British finally got kind of upset about sitting on the data for so long, and then he published an article on the ozone hole in Nature. The Americans rechecked. Turns out the satellite had been working just fine. The problem was that the computer used to interpret the data had thrown out the evidence of an ozone hole. A blind spot had been actually built into the system, the program, that was interpreting data from the satellite. So, science didn't speak up for a while anyway. The British didn't speak up because they didn't want to look bad to the Americans. Okay? This happens, by the way, in other cases where people see things that the Americans don't agree with, and so forth. The fact is that they withheld data of great importance. The Americans, meanwhile, literally programmed a blind spot into their own computer. If the British had not published, how long would this situation have continued? And by the way, when the world was finally convinced that there was an ozone hole, there was a huge reaction to ban the chlorofluorocarbons that were causing, it was thought, the deficits in the ozone. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that truth in science can be at the mercy of human emotions and human error. Now, an interesting example of these human emotions and human error is the situation with meteorites. Many of you will know that in the 18th century, for the most part, science didn't believe that meteorites were real. And as an example of this kind of opinion, I'm going to read you this quote from James Pringle, who was later president of the Royal Society of Great Britain. And he said, "And here I venture to affirm that after perusing all the accounts I could find of these phenomena, I have met with no well-vouched instance of such an event. Nor is it to be imagined that if these meteors had really fallen, there must have been long ago so strong evidence of the fact as to leave no doubt of it at present. Now just imagine we substitute UFOs for meteors in this sentence, and we've got the current public attitude about UFOs. That if UFOs really existed, there must have been evidence of it. It's so strong. Carl Sagan actually said this one time, by the way, while showing a videotape of a grazing meteor. Now, another issue with this is, of course, physical evidence. And we like to think that physical evidence would be absolutely decisive in a case like this. If we had a fragment of a UFO or something like that, we would know. Well, unfortunately, physical evidence is only as good as the system that interprets that evidence. An example is in 1769, a little later in the 18th century, the French Academy of Sciences had 3 meteorites in their hands from 3 different falls. This was a wonderful chance for them to show that they recognized what this was. But the chemical analysis done by, admittedly, some of the most talented people in France, Lavoisier was on the team, were unable to detect that all 3 stones had fallen from the sky. What did they decide? Well, they thought that they were 3 stones that had been hit by lightning. And they said probably lightning often hits pyrites, the ferrous sulfide. In other words, they completely blew it. Now finally, attitudes about witnesses and things like that often get in the way of truth. What we know can get in the way of what we find out. In 1790, there was a huge fall of meteorites in the area in France where they make this wonderful brandy called Armagnac. And in a small village, La Grange-la-Juillac, I don't know how many, but something on the order of 1,000 stones fell. It hit roofs, hit cattle and so forth, dug holes in the ground in some cases. And nearby, in the city of Ozone, there was a French scientist named Saint-Amand. And Saint-Amand was very interested in hearing about this strange event, and so he wrote to Lagrange and asked for their agreement that this has actually taken place. And he then got a legal protocol signed by the mayor and town attorney, and apparently 300 other people would have also borne witness to this particular event. And they sent him some stones that had fallen from the sky. So Saint-Amand didn't really know what to do with these data, so he sent them on to a scientific journal, the Journal of the Useful Sciences. And this is what the editor of that journal, Pierre Berthelon, said about this event. He said, if the readers have already had occasion to deplore the error of some individuals, how much more will they be appalled today seeing a whole municipality attest to, consecrate by a legal protocol in good form these same popular sensations, which can only excite the pity not only of physicists, but of all reasonable people. What can we add here to such an affidavit? All the reflections which it suggests will present themselves to the philosophical reader in reading this authentic attestation of an obviously wrong fact of a phenomenon physically, and it tells you in the original here, physically impossible, okay? In other words, why do they have the shame to make witness to these things that obviously are just crazy? However, help was on the way. And one day in 1792, there was you might call a bull session between 2 scientists. We talk about the scientific method. And the words bull session typically don't occur in the scientific method, but sometimes that's what leads to scientific discoveries, as it did in this case. Ernst Chladni, who was an expert on acoustics, was talking to George Christoph Lichtenberg, a brilliant polymath in Göttingen, Germany, about meteors. And Chladni asked Lichtenberg what meteors were. Now, meteors, by the way, are those things that go zooming across the sky. Only if they fall do they become meteorites. So Lichtenberg said, well, maybe it's an electrical phenomenon. And Chladni said, no. He said, I don't really think that because the electrical charge in the sky, lightning basically is forked, and this is a straight line. So Lichtenberg then made a very interesting suggestion. He said, well, maybe, he said, they are cosmic. They come from outer space. So Chladni was very interested by this, and he went down to the public library. This is also not typically part of the scientific method, but it was in this case. And he read for about 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, he said, and it became obvious to me that often stone and iron masses fell down following an exploding fireball. So the fact is, he went to the library, he put testimonies together, and he said, hey, there's a real phenomenon here, and this is what it is. And here's a picture of Chladni, who traveled, by the way, very widely in Europe, showing off his musical experiments and apparatus. And here is a statue of Georges Christophe Lichtenberg, by the way, an amazing person who was famous for his aphorisms, and he made some, by the way, about meteorites, too, eventually. And this is the book. You can see this below here, published in 1794 by Chladni. This was basically the first scientific book on meteorites. And so, what do we learn from this case? We learn that sometimes anecdotal evidence is very valuable if it's put together and understood by the right person. So the value of evidence is often in the mind or capabilities of the person who interprets it. What happened to Chladni as a result of publishing this book? Well, he had some skeptics back then who felt that Chladni had used information that was basically tainted because the people who saw these meteorites were often people of low social status, like peasants and so forth. And so one of his detractors, Jean-André Deluc, who wrote numerous articles explaining that Chladni was in error, said, "It is thus that events badly seen and badly judged, of which volcanic phenomena above all present many examples, cause naturalists to err, believing in the exactitude of the accounts. They will form systems based on them that will be without foundation." Does this sound like UFOs? Okay. Lichtenberg, by the way, was really unhappy with Chladni for publishing the book, and he told him he wished he hadn't done it. So, this began a controversy. Around the turn of the century, scientists began to discuss meteorites more commonly. They did chemical analyses, and these chemical analyses suggested some singular things which had been passed over in the previous analyses. And while these ideas were swirling around, a major meteorite fall changed scientific opinion. In the little town of L'Aigle, which means eagle in French, by the way, 1803, a swarm of stones fell. L'Aigle was 70 miles, if my memory serves, from the French Academy of Sciences in Paris. And you can barely see this, but there's meteorites falling in the back here. And so the Academy decided it would send somebody to investigate what had happened at L'Aigle. And they sent this person, Jean-Baptiste Biot, which I think I misspelled here, to investigate. Biot, by the way, had previously announced that he thought meteorites might be something of interest to science, and so his being sent was not entirely an accident. But he then investigated this fall of meteorites, and he announced in the end that this fall seemed to be something that was real and not imaginary. He noted, you can barely see this on, unfortunately, not very good image of this, that the stones had fallen in an ellipse, which is exactly how you would expect a swarm of things that came in at an angle to show themselves. He found that a local corresponding member of the French Academy of Sciences was local, and he had seen the falls, so he was okay guy, and that his testimony could be taken seriously. To a very large extent, by the way, this convinced people in Europe that meteorites were real. In the United States, by the way, we had Thomas Jefferson, and in 1807 there was a fall of stones in Connecticut, if memory serves correctly, in Weston, Connecticut, and Thomas Jefferson was apparently shown some of the stones and asked what he thought of this. And he said to the scientific man who brought him the stones, he said, "I can tell you my reaction to this in 5 words." He said, "It is all a lie." And he's also suspected to have remarked something to the effect that he would rather believe that 2 Yankee professors would lie than that stones would fall from the air, which I think is an interesting example of regional prejudice here. So 2 major points. First of all, because something is surprising doesn't mean that it is not real. And second, it is wrong to rule out events without a serious investigation. And then a third point, and the third point is perhaps the less obvious one, and that is that scientists may not be very good judges of what they would know, since they overestimate the flow of information to them. Scientists especially may not realize that people won't tell them things if scientists don't seem open-minded. The scientist says, "Well, I'm an expert, and if I'm an expert, I would know if this stuff was going on." But even if the scientist is an expert, in fact, sometimes precisely because the scientist is an expert, when anomalies are involved, he or she doesn't know, okay? Experts are expert at what has happened before. They're not necessarily experts about what will happen in the future. So with hidden events then, things may be going on, but if they're going on underneath the radar, the scientist's estimate of what he or she would know may be wrong. And I've called this the fallacy of centrality. The expert thinks that he or she is in the center of a network. And so, if stuff is going on, they'd know. Well, it often is going on, and they don't know. So are scientists stupid? No, of course not. But sometimes, and this is very occasionally, I suppose, a little sociology would be helpful to scientists when it comes to understanding the dynamics of people reporting anomalous events. Okay, so much for the 18th century. Let's go up to the 20th century, and we see another case of a hidden event. And this hidden event is the battered child syndrome. Now, this man, John Caffey, a pediatric radiologist, was one of the first people to publish an article about child abuse. And he had noticed that in the cases that were brought to him, where children had long bones in different stages of healing, often the arms or the legs or the fingers or whatever, there were frequently brain bleeds that were associated, in his experience, with trauma. So he published this article called, this is the title, Multiple Fractures in the Long Bones of Infants Suffering from Chronic Subdural Hematoma. Okay? And this article did not exactly produce a revolution, because Caffey did not say that he thought these injuries might be inflicted by parents or other caregivers of these children. But it was the first paper by a radiologist describing what Caffey was calling to his residents multiple unexplained traumata. In print, however, he was very cautious. He saw the pattern. He discussed it in print. He noted that often the patient's history didn't explain the injuries. But he didn't want to accuse the parents, because that might involve legal difficulties. And the reason that he didn't want to have any legal difficulties is he was in the middle of developing pediatric radiology. By the way, he wrote a handbook about that that's still in print, by I think the 7th edition or something now. So he described the syndrome but didn't discuss its cause. His residents, however, Frederick Silverman and Bertram Giordani, published papers on their own observations, Paul Woolley and William Evans, another pediatrician and radiologist, respectively, published an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association suggesting that some children with traumata had been intentionally injured. And finally, Elizabeth Elmer, a social worker, discovered that child abuse is not uncommon and published an article in 1957 about it. Now, it's interesting to see how Elmer came to this conclusion. And it all happened one night when she was sent up to the infant floor at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. She was told to go up to the infant's floor and look at a potential case of child abuse. When she got there, she asked the charge nurse for, and she described the injuries and so forth, and the charge nurse came out with 6 cards. Elizabeth Elmer said, "If I had thought in such terms at all, I would have considered the original case unique. But in a few minutes' revealing talk with the nurse, abuse had become a class of events with ramifications beyond one infant and one family." And this is an interesting example of what you call a summation effect, is it's often the fact of multiple things coming together basically at the same time that suggests to you that there's something worth looking into. Yet other people felt that this may simply have been a mistake, okay? One physician, in fact, wondered in an article if the real problem was not abuse, but bone fragility. Now, this was in spite of the fact that many of the physicians involved with this had discovered that if you took children to the hospital, their bones stopped getting broken. And similarly, the phrase spontaneous subdural hematomas, which used to occur in medical texts, actually is something that doesn't really happen. Subdural hematomas are typically due to trauma. And when Caffey discovered that, that was the thing that suggested to him that these children were being abused. Pediatricians did not like the idea that parents could abuse kids. One pediatrician stood up at a meeting. He said, "If I believed that parents could do this to their children, I would leave pediatrics immediately." The first physicians to recognize this, however, when they went around, began to collect reports. This is what I call a report release phenomenon. And I'm quoting Paul Woolley here. He said, "The first 3 or 4 times I went out in the boondocks to talk about this, I remember one trip down to San Antonio. Usually everybody gathered." And he said, "Then some of the older, experienced pediatricians would sneak up to you during the cocktail hour in the lobby of the hotel, and they would say, 'You know, I've seen a number of these and I've wondered about it. There's just nothing written on it.'" Okay? The person who made the big difference with the battered child syndrome was this man, Henry Kemp. He was a brilliant pediatrician. He was, I think, appointed at age 33 to the head of pediatrics at the University of Colorado. And I've interviewed him, by the way, a couple of weeks before he passed on. And this is what he said about the child abuse cases. He said, "I was intellectually offended at first, before my better instincts took over, by the simply silly diagnoses being made by Bright House staff in situations where nothing but child abuse could have been the diagnosis. The common denominator was a denial of child abuse by these fine young doctors who simply could not face the facts of life. I was angry that we ourselves, pediatricians, were not doing the job, and also we were not helping the social work departments, who were supposed to be doing it, and in fact had been doing it for 100 years. Doctors didn't help them. Social workers were over there. The doctors were over here. The courts were archaic. Social workers and doctors didn't talk until the mid-1950s. So, what did Kemp do? He formed a team, an interdisciplinary team. With the cooperation of radiologists and social workers, and a pediatrician, obviously, it was possible to diagnose and treat cases of child abuse. This meant that physicians were more willing to see child abuse because now they could do something about it. So the general point that we might get from this is that when we're empowered to take action, we are more likely to perceive the things we need to do something about. The battered child syndrome grew through awareness. Somehow I seem to have lost a slide here. But one of the things I ought to mention, because it's very important, is that Henry Kemp had an epiphany about this when he became chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics in 1961. He was given one panel at the national meeting where he could discuss anything he wanted, and he decided that it would be child abuse. And this meeting was taking place in the Palmer House in Chicago. I don't know how many of you have been to Chicago. You know where the Palmer House is. He decided that the panel on child abuse would be in the Grand Ballroom, and he decided to come up with a sexy title for what it was, and that's how they coined the term the Battered Child Syndrome. He invited the press. He had an interdisciplinary panel, and people kept coming up to him all day. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, the Palmer House Grand Ballroom holds 1,000 people. It was full. He blew this problem wide open. So one of the interesting things about this, though, and I think this is at the core of what hidden events are all about, is that Kemp commissioned a survey done by a sociologist as to how many child abuse events there were in the United States. A survey of hospitals and police departments and so on came up with something like 700 cases. 700 cases, all right? Well, today we realize that there are probably something like millions, I don't know how many millions, of child abuse and neglect events in the United States. It's only some fraction of which are reported. So what was originally a hidden event became a social problem. By connecting the dots, Kemp got child abuse to fit into the medical system. Laws were passed mandating reporting by child abuse. Doctors, by the way, were required in many states to report apparent child abuse, which was too bad because often doctors were not very good reporters. People who report child abuse are more often nurses, child care workers, teachers, and so forth. Child abuse eventually became a specialization. And now there's another aspect of this that's very interesting, and that is that Kemp knew perfectly well, and the people who work with him knew perfectly well, that there was a large amount of sexual abuse of children as well. Kemp and his colleagues decided that they would suppress that knowledge because they wanted to make sure that the physical event stuff got accepted first, and then some 17 years later they published an article about the sexual abuse of children, and that became a major issue, okay? Interesting to think that basically people who knew about a social problem didn't say anything about it because they wanted to make sure that the previous social problem got accepted first. Now, meanwhile, obviously, an awful lot of covering up has been done by the Catholic Church of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church of kids and so forth. And I think here's another example of a hidden event. Suddenly, as one set of reports after another appeared in the newspapers, more and more people came forward and started to talk about their experiences. Perfect example of report release, very typical of hidden events. And of course, we realize today that this is an endemic problem which the church has essentially refused to face, not only for the last few decades, but also for apparently hundreds of years, according to people who studied it. Now, in the 21st century, science is different today, right? It's modern. You know, we're much smarter than we used to be. Surely you would think science wouldn't behave the same way that it had previously. And yet, from a sociological point of view, it's very likely that what I've described is a very typical behavior for science. And by the way, I've studied lots of other hidden events, too, that I don't have time to talk about. So we would like to think that science has matured, that it's better today. But yet, we have UFOs. Well, are UFOs hidden events? Well, maybe not. I mean, after all, online it used to be that UFOs were second only to pornography, okay? But they're often ignored by newspapers, especially the big city newspapers. People who have UFO sightings seldom report them, and in fact, A lot of people don't think there is any place to report UFOs to, although some people manage to make reports to MUFON or NUFORC or something like that. The Air Force says it no longer accepts citizen UFO reports, although, of course, it certainly does from the armed forces. So as far as the public knows, UFO reports are rare. In fact, if you ask most people you know today, how many UFO sightings are there, they'll tell you they don't really happen anymore. On television, UFO specials are heavily skewed toward the skeptical opinions. I don't know how many of you have seen a UFO special that ends up, and finally they bring a skeptic out and he says, well, it's all smoke and mirrors, optical illusions, misunderstandings, hoax, fraud. History Channel is a wonderful exception to this, by the way. So let's talk a little bit about flying saucers. Some of you will recognize this as Kenneth Arnold, ostensibly making the first report about flying saucers in 1947. Of course, those of you who are readers of the subject know that 1947 was not the beginning. And it's interesting also that 1947 was a year of UFO reports all over the United States. Ted Blocher, an investigator who went from, he was a newspaper reporter, went from one small city to another looking in newspaper offices, found that a very large number of UFOs sightings had taken place in 1947. And of course, 1947 was also the year of the UFO crash at Roswell. People often talk about cover-ups and that cover-ups are not very effective and so forth. I think here's a perfect example of a brilliant cover-up. It worked extremely well. One day, the Army Air Force described a flying saucer that had crashed on a ranch in the Roswell region. And then, almost the next day, we find that there really wasn't anything at all. It was a weather balloon, according to the military. Now, today, we know a lot more about Roswell than we did back then. It turns out that there are literally hundreds of witnesses to various aspects of the Roswell event. And for me, the most significant detail is that the cover-up was one that was pursued with the most violent means imaginable. Literally, entire families were threatened with death if they said anything about the Roswell event. My father worked on the atomic bomb. He was one of the people who isolated plutonium. Nothing like that level of secrecy prevailed in Chicago, where they were busy isolating this very important ingredient of one of the two atomic bombs. In 1948, we had the Aztec, New Mexico crash. An excellent book on this has just been written by the Ramis. This has an interesting history, by the way. The crash came out originally in a lecture given at a local college by Silas Newton, a local oil man. And Mr. Newton was a person of very considerable engineering ability. He gave this talk off the cuff, and he talked about this crash in Aztec, New Mexico, that apparently several scientists had told him about. And eventually Frank Scully published a book about this with a somewhat sensational cover. And all of us in the UFO business basically believed that this was a hoax, okay? That Frank Scully's book was written essentially from a hoax made out of pure cloth, and the events didn't take place. Mr. Newton had gotten sued by one of his business customers, I guess, and it was assumed that Mr. Newton was a fraud, and therefore the whole enterprise was fraudulent, and that crash went away. Again, cover-up can be very effective. And by the way, the journalist who helped to make Frank Scully look like a hoaxer also was helped in great extent by the FBI, people who often appear later in our story. So here's the book that the Ramis wrote. I recommend it. They've spent, I guess, 25 years of their adult lives writing this, and have looked into this case to a very great extent. Now, meanwhile, the Air Force had decided to set up some study projects There were 3 of them that had names. The first one, Project Sign, was actually pretty competent, involved some very high-level people in the military, but it didn't last very long because it came up with the wrong conclusion. It decided that there really was something to UFOs. So they created Project Grudge. I think you can understand the attitude from the title. And this eventually morphed, because even that wasn't quite acceptable to the public, into Project Blue Book. Now, the Air Force had very good reason to have these projects because they were having all kinds of problems. Most of you will know as much about them as I do. I still remember as a kid listening to the radio and hearing this stuff go on and so forth when I was much younger. And so the Air Force was concerned about the public's attitude about what was happening, and the public, of course, didn't know what was going to happen next. So what the Air Force decided to do essentially was to create a bureaucratic solution to this problem, and the bureaucratic solution was to provide explanations for the events that happened, and they were very good at this. Extremely dishonest, by the way. Okay, so here is the staff of Project Blue Book with one of its leaders. Count the number of people you see. If there was the danger, which some people thought about, of an interplanetary invasion, we've got 5 people on the project. Okay, what did they have time to do? Yeah, that's what they did. They didn't do very much because they didn't have any time to do any serious investigating. They certainly didn't have teams of laboratories and so forth set up to process any data they got, and most of the time they simply decided it was either Venus or a weather balloon or something. Led by middle-rank officers and largely lacking occupational clout, and of course, by the way, in the military, it's not unusual to change officers about every 2 years. Blue Book's personnel mostly investigated from their desks. Explanations for good sightings were often done casually. The causes were assigned were often ludicrous. They attempted to minimize the strangeness. And in the end, certainly for much of Blue Book's existence, it was a public relations exercise. In spite of the fact that occasionally they did commission some good reports. Here's one of them. By 1966, the Air Force was tired of UFOs. There were too many sightings, there was too much attention by the press, and they were afraid that, they said, that the noise created by all the public furor over UFOs and so on might mask some real dangers, such as a Russian incursion, and they wanted to make it go away. So they turned to science, okay? A major university, the University of Colorado, was hired to do a study. Its director, Edward Condon, was negative from the start. The Condon report eventually would say that the study of UFOs did not have national security implications and contributed little to science. Unfortunately, however, the study was biased from the beginning. The university and the study director are both handpicked to deliver a negative verdict. Even a later evaluation of the study by the National Academy of Sciences involved a handpicked panel, apparently chosen by Hugh Odeshaw, Condon's co-author of the Handbook of Physics. Here's Condon, famous for, by the way, for his resistance to the McCarthy investigations. Here's the Condon report, came out in 68 or 69, I can't remember which year. It was bad science. It was loaded with bias. The report, though, found that roughly 30% of reports remained unknown after investigation. This percentage of unknowns got scant attention in the summary to this 800 or so page book, which is all most reporters read. There were many events that the report ignored or simply explained away. The Air Force withheld data in many cases. They simply said, we're just not going to tell you what happened, especially when dealing with nuclear weapons incidents such as the Malmstrom Air Force Base incident in 1967. The Condon report is a perfect example of science done to reach a prearranged conclusion. And here's another interesting fact. How many of you have been on a scientific panel? Any scientists here? I can't tell, okay? Well, the fact is that quite often you can get the answer you want if you pick the right panel. And that's exactly what they did. The Air Force knew what it wanted and picked a group that could reliably deliver that result. Even a review by the National Academy of Sciences that approved the panel turned out to be handpicked. And they were handpicked by Condon's co-editor, and it says Clifford here, but it was actually Hugh Odeshaw. Odeshaw even bragged about stacking the panel. So much for objectivity. Okay, so the way science is often done is different than the textbook image of science. When the report came out, the Air Force hoped that it was done with UFOs forever. A lot of people thought UFOs had gone away. The Air Force had made them vanish, even though members of the committee published a book, some of the members anyway, about where the Condon Committee had gone wrong. So did UFOs really go away? Well, of course not. But magazines literally wrote articles such as, "Where have all the UFOs gone?" And then in 1973, I still remember this, in 1973, the Pascagoula abduction blew the whole thing wide open, all over again. I'm not going to run through the Pascagoula case for those of you who don't know, but roughly speaking, there was a rather horrendous abduction in Pascagoula, Mississippi. 2 workers from the local shipyard were abducted and taken aboard, apparently, a UFO. When they were finished, you can actually see from pictures taken of the people at the time the look of shock and horror on the face of these 2 men. Well, in the end then, the Condon report did what? The Air Force got the conclusion it wanted. The University of Colorado got its money. The scientists involved didn't have to compromise their principles. Most of them believed their own conclusions, and only the public was cheated of the inquiry they had paid for. But data was withheld. The Air Force didn't share everything it knew. This was their set of scientists, right? Did they tell them the truth? No. Here's a perfect example. The year that the report was finished, and I'm not exactly sure about the publishing details here, but on October 24th, 1968, at a Strategic Air Command base in North Dakota holding Minuteman ICBMs and B-52s, a huge UFO, 150 to 200 feet long and shining like a miniature sun, landed on the runway. And just about this time, a B-52 was landing at the base, and they vectored the B-52 at low level to fly over the UFO, okay? 150 feet long, shining like a miniature sun. And this was after already the bomber had previously tracked another UFO at 3,900 miles per hour. When Blue Book investigated, Blue Book was still around in '68, the members of Blue Book assigned to investigate this case did not even have the clearances to talk to the bomber pilots. Fortunately for us, however, this event was carefully investigated some years back by Tom Tulien and his colleagues, who did an in-depth analysis of the case. They interviewed 35 people, including the bomber pilots, most of whom are retired now. The report included material from 35 interviews. The report was far more penetrating than the Blue Book report, which, by the way, decided that the UFO was ball lightning. How many of you know what ball lightning is? You know what the typical size of ball lightning is? It's usually about this size, or maybe a yard. It's not going to be 150 feet long. So what was this that landed on the runway? And by the way, if there's anything that typifies national security, it is a Strategic Air Command. This is our most vital resource, basically, in defending the United States against nuclear attack. So, the fact is that there is a long history of involvement with nuclear weapons and UFOs. And it was only brought to my attention recently how strong this history is by this book by Robert Hastings called UFOs and Nukes. It is impossible to read this book and not to get upset about the Air Force covering up the long history, which I'm sure has continued, according to Bob Hastings. It's still going on, basically, of the involvement of UFOs with nuclear weapons. In some cases, nuclear weapons have been compromised by the presence of UFOs. In other cases, in one particular case I can think of, the launch sequence was actually started on one of the missiles and had to be manually shut down. So much for the idea that UFOs are not associated with national security. If this doesn't get your blood boiling, I don't know what will. The recent history by Richard Dolan of the CIA's involvement with the UFO business, I think, is a very interesting corrective to the idea that somehow UFOs have gone away and that this matter has been largely solved. Obviously, it hasn't. I think Leslie Kane's recent book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, is a fascinating example of how very important UFO events are still happening. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was very fortunate to hear General de Brouwer's discussion of the Belgian wave of UFO sightings in the early 90s. The Belgians basically had a huge flap of triangular UFOs, and they were very concerned about it at the time, and they obviously still don't know what this was. So finally, in trying to bring this to some sort of conclusion, let me suggest this. When science conflicts with politics, politics may win. Politics may contribute to hidden events being suppressed, and when the events are politically inconvenient, they may simply disappear. So I'm going to leave you with this question. Actually, I'm going to give you a conclusion too, sorry. If higher authority found out about UFOs, would they tell you? And so here are some conclusions, basically. First of all, the history of science shows that science is often imperfect, and it's especially imperfect when it comes to hidden events. Scientists may not understand the processes often that bring information to them about hidden events. And scientists often do not understand how their own attitudes and statements may prevent information flow about hidden events. When information about hidden events becomes caught up in the political process, embarrassing events may get suppressed. Official science, then, as part of the power structure of society, may be pressured by its political masters, and I use that word advisedly, to suppress the truth. And so finally, this is my conclusion. It is important that there's an alternative channel, a citizen path to truth, and I think that MUFON provides that path, and I think it has to be protected. Thank you very much. So, are there any questions? I guess we've got one.
Hello. The example cited of the meteorites was over 200 years ago. Has not science and the scientific method advanced enough over the past 200 years, remember, scientific method, that something so basic as a UFO would be recognized by the scientific community? Furthermore, the monetary value of any legitimate proof of a UFO would be out of this world.
Yes, okay. So the question you've asked is basically, you know, given that we have modern science today, would modern science behave as badly, seemingly, as the scientists in the 18th century? And by the way, if you go back to the 18th century, what you see scientists saying is very much the same thing. They say, well, after all, this is the 18th century. We're not going to believe superstitions. Well, hey, what do they say today? They say, you know, we're so much better than we used to be, and of course we've got all these machines and other stuff and so forth. The example of the ozone hole gives you some idea of how badly science can screw up. This was a very serious screw up. When you add politics to science, I mean, there were no politics basically about the meteorite question. There may have been some politics associated with the Battered child syndrome, by contrast. But the fact is that scientists today, there is a sociology of science. I mean, that's what I used to do before I got involved in some other stuff. The fact is, scientific method is not a single thing. Scientists use a huge range of methods. It's a very complicated process, and as the Chladni example suggests, even a bull session between people can lead to important scientific discoveries. So we'd like to think that science has got a method. If we apply the method, everything is going to be fine. Look at the Condon report if you believe that, okay? The Condon report is testimony to a very different view of science. And that view of science is a far more political view. There's a book called The Brain Bank of America, and it's about the National Academy of Sciences. And basically it affirms the kind of things that I've talked about here. What I said about picking committees so you get the right answer, everybody knows this. This goes on all the time, okay? Yeah, we'd like to believe that science is advanced. And as for the economic issue you raised, of course, this is worth an awful lot of money, but it's for exactly that reason that whoever's got the information is not likely to want to share it. We have another question.
Yeah, Leslie Keane's book is excellent, and she, I think, was at the convention 2009 in Santa Clara. What I wanted to ask you about, though, with meteorites falling in France, did those kill anybody, you know, hit them on the head? And the second question is, I saw a history program, or, you know, a program on TV where the Pharaoh had allegedly made a staff out of meteorites. So if the Egyptians were aware of meteorites, I'm kind of surprised it didn't permeate out to other places.
The question you're basically asking is, could scientists forget? Well, they obviously didn't study. Actually, it's been theorized the Spartans, by the way, made their swords out of meteorites. And meteoritic iron is very low in carbon. So you actually could get some very fine swords out of meteorites. And in fact, many blacksmiths did. One of the reasons that meteorites in the 18th century attracted the attention they did was that some of them ended up in a blacksmith place being used to make steel, which, by the way, in the old days was a very expensive substance. Any other questions?
Ron, that was a very interesting talk. I wanted to mention a modern-day example of the meteorites, one that you might be familiar with. I don't know if anyone's done sociological research on it. But back in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, there were many reports by airline pilots of mysterious glows above the tops of thunderstorms, which are nowadays called sprites.
Right.
These were titanic objects, electrical activity of some sort, that defied our then understanding of atmospheric electricity. And only one scientist, to my knowledge, took it seriously, Bernie Vonnegut at SUNY Buffalo, who happened to be the brother of Kurt Vonnegut, the novelist. And he wrote an article about it for WeatherWise, which is this sort of popular level meteorology journal that wasn't really taken seriously by atmospheric scientists. And it wasn't until the early 90s that a video camera accidentally recorded one of these sprites that scientists began saying this is real. This has been reported by commercial airline pilots for many years, but they weren't taken seriously because it didn't fit into the paradigm of atmospheric science.
Maybe they're the contemporary peasants.
Yeah.
Okay, so not worthy of informing scientists who know better. Okay.
Yeah. I think there are class issues here that are worth keeping in mind.
Yes, very much so. And in fact, this is true of all kinds of hidden events. One other thing that I would like to mention that's very similar to this is actually noise from meteors. I don't know if you realize this, but people sometimes hear noises coming from meteors. Well, meteors are way up in the atmosphere, and sound shouldn't be able to reach you that fast. It only travel 1,000 feet a second. So it's impossible to hear meteors, right? Because they're too far away. Well, apparently not. And the famous meteoriticist Ninninger actually did a study of meteor noise and so forth. But this too was a hidden event, okay? Because meteoriticists didn't like to believe that people could hear things that were too far away. So I don't know where this, anybody, a meteoriticist, where this is today, but I think meteor noise is still highly controversial.
Hi, I'm Will Wakely from San Diego. How much of current science and academia is actually beholden to government funding? And is that one of the reasons that they perhaps are held back on what they disclose?
Absolutely. There's a famous example of the Santa Barbara oil spill, okay? And the locals decided that they were going to look for a petroleum geologist who wasn't associated with the petroleum industry. Everybody, basically, in petroleum geology had taken money from the petroleum industry, okay? So find the person who, didn't have any ties. I remember one time there was a meeting at NASA where I was one of the participants, and the participants were selected because they hadn't recently had a NASA contract, and they hadn't recently published any information on the topic in hand. So we were the wallflowers, okay? We looked at each other and thought, God, we're all the leftovers, all right? But that's how much, it's very difficult to find people who are not somehow taking money from industry. And the big problem with government panels of all kinds is to find somebody who's both expert and who's also willing to testify to the truth, which is different than what the industry would like to have known. It's a very tough proposition. Please.
Would you agree that most organizations have a political structure within them?
I'm a student of complex organizations. I absolutely agree.
What is it that you think that MUFON could do to protect itself from political elitism within its own organization, so as to provide everybody from the top to the bottom with similar information, if not the same?
The basic way you encourage democracy is you encourage empowerment. You give people the power to speak their minds. As long as they do, it's very difficult to throttle information. In voluntary associations like MUFON, there's often what's called the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which is basically the few people end up running things and they determine what can be said and what can't be said. Organizations that want to resist oligarchy typically have a variety of institutions, rules of free speech and so forth that protect members' ability to speak. And so I think probably it's the state directors. How many of you are state directors in here? Show of hands? Okay, well, state directors are a perfect example of basically spreading power around. I think it's an excellent way to create a kind of democratic organization.
Do you see any solutions to the political bias that a lot of scientists face?
It's an interesting question. One of the interesting things to do is compare the United States, which has a long history of basically suppressing information about UFOs, with France, which has an official organization, as we saw last night, to investigate them. In France, there was at least quasi-independent political base where people basically said, we think this is very important and we're not going to allow it to sort of go by the boards. I think it doesn't say very much about the United States that our own political scientific elite has not basically stood up to the government on this particular issue. And that would be a much longer discussion, but I think, here is something, I think MUFON and previous to that, NICAP and APRO and so forth, have a long history of basically resisting what the government has tried to do to suppress information about UFOs. But I don't have any ultimate solution. The best ultimate thing may simply be the fact that the government can control information, but it can't control UFOs.
So just an additional comment. In my job, I am developing methods for laser cutting very thin glass. And at my company, I'm the closest thing to an expert that exists on doing this. It's not something that's been done recently. We're just now pioneering the methods for manufacturing this glass so that we can ship it to people on rolls. In fact, we receive it from the factory on rolls. Hard for me to get my mind around that, but the reason I wanted to come up and say this is I am recognized as an expert, and at least once a week, somebody will come into my lab, tell me how to do my job. They don't know where to turn the machine on.
Well, I've spent a lot of time basically advising people on research and development. And I think one of the givens of research and development is that if you're in the laboratory, and even if you're absolutely certain you're right, and you've got all the evidence and so forth, the guy can also, the boss can come in and say, well, you know, but we just don't see any future in this. And the examples of this are legion. Everybody in the R&D business knows about the inability of the Xerox laboratory in Palo Alto to advance the personal computer. They had a far superior computer to anybody else and basically gave it away to Apple because their own management wasn't willing to push it. RCA had a video disc system long before anybody else did. Management didn't believe that it was going to work, and they didn't do anything with it. The Xerox process was offered to any number of large companies, Kodak and so forth, and they all turned it down and said, you know, it doesn't really make sense. I can go on and on and on, but you get the picture. I think that's all the questions.
All right, so we are going to take about a 15-minute break. We have one more speaker before our dinner break, which will be Dr. Stephen Greer. So take this opportunity to stretch your legs, check out the vendor room. We have art exhibit.